Finally the MCU gets better from here. After The Incredible Hulk, Iron Man 2, and Thor, I was beginning to think that the light at the end of the tunnel didn't really exist. And then Captain America the First Avenger came along and... Oh, right. Spoilers ahead for Captain America the First Avenger and the rest of the MCU, and of course you already knew that. So, Captain America the First Avenger. It's often forgotten by MCU fans because of, well, The Winter Soldier and Civil War, but it has quietly gotten a little following of its own. While maybe not as showy or flashy as the other two films, I had quite an enjoyable time with this movie. Is it perfect? Well, no film is certainly, but this film doesn't really reach that upper tier for me. But what it lacks in overabundant charisma or large sequences, it makes up for with its heart. The vast majority of the film is spent with Steve Rogers, and it was actually quite surprising to me to see the ratio of scenes spent on this character compared to the other storylines. Actually, there really aren't that many other storylines. While superhero films often spend about 3/4 of the time on their heroes and maybe a quarter on the villain, I found that maybe about 90% of this movie was on Steve Rogers. And it really felt like that was intentional. I think Iron Man also did something very similar with its hero, spending about 80% of the time with Tony, and it's no wonder that these two Avengers have the fullest and most complete arcs in the MCU. Jon Favreau and Joe Johnston, the director of this film, did a lot of heavy lifting up front, which enabled later filmmakers to come in and really explore and dive deeper into these characters. The CGI for skinny Steve Rogers is still unbelievable. The fact that they were able to pull off something like this in 2011 is still amazing to me, as it really does feel believable that that version of Steve Rogers could have been real before the transformation to the Captain America that we all know. And it does a lot to build up his character quickly. I mean, the scene in the alley where he's being beat up by the guy and he's holding the trash can lid, that basically says it all about who Steve Rogers is as a person. And I think what the MCU has been lacking thus far, it really found in this character. It found heart, a guy to root for. When Dr. Erskine is talking to him and saying that what makes him special is that he's a good man, that really did resonate. Because it makes sense that Dr. Erskine would overlook all the more physically qualified candidates to go for the little guy, the one with the bigger heart. Even after he gets the serum, the film does an excellent job at establishing the fact that he's still the same person, just equipped with a new body and new strength. To be completely honest, Chris Evans' acting has always been a little one note for me though, which, in terms of this character, has always been fine since Captain America is, the moral compass of the group, I guess, the North Star. But especially in this first film, I almost wanted to tell him to loosen up just a little bit, because in some of his scenes, it just feels like half of his lines are delivered the exact same way, with the exact same inflection. Maybe that's the appeal of this character? I don't know. I just always happen to notice it when watching his films. Speaking of noticeable things though, here's something else that I noticed when watching this movie, and I think this is probably one of the biggest negatives that I have with this film. Throughout the entirety of the running time, I was so thoroughly, constantly aware that I was watching a movie. It almost felt like the propaganda films that Steve was watching in the theater, actually. Everyone always talks about the montage scenes and how they don't really fit well in the film. And while I don't totally agree, as I think they're pretty enjoyable, every time the film would break into a montage, and it would happen a lot, like when Erskine is explaining Red Skull's backstory, or when Steve is invading all those Hydra bases, or when Steve is being used for propaganda, the film would just feel like a film. It's almost like watching a World War II documentary. With a film like Iron Man, it really felt immersive, like you were a part of the world that Tony Stark was in. But when you're watching Steve, you almost feel like an outsider looking in. And maybe that is intentional, but it just didn't quite get me as invested into the film as I really wanted to be. Getting back to the positives though, the rest of the supporting cast is outstanding. Haley Atwell's Peggy Carter is an extremely strong character, and it's easy to see why Marvel spun her off into her own show. Her relationship with Steve, while maybe not quite as strong as Tony and Pepper, is definitely stronger than Banner and Ross or Thor and Jane, and it helps establish Steve's motivation later on in the MCU, like in films like Endgame. Stanley Tucci as Dr. Erskine is also absolutely wonderful, although I have to say he kind of reminds me of Yinsen in Iron Man, especially the way that he dies and the message that he gives to Steve. There are actually some really interesting parallels between the two films, with both films opening about a third of the way through and then flashing back to explain how they got there. Maybe this was around the time when Marvel wasn't so sure of themselves and they were using a kind of mold which has been referred to later as the Marvel formula. And Tommy Lee Jones is a national treasure. He steals every scene that he's in because he's just that charismatic. I completely forgot that he was in the MCU until I rewatched this film, and he ate up scenes with his dry, sarcastic sense of humor. And Hugo Weaving. So, let's talk about Red Skull. Now, A lot of people are split on this character, with many saying that Red Skull is one of their favorite villains in the MCU, while others don't really like him. Here's what I think and what I realized. It's very, very important in a film to separate the character and the performance sometimes. Because, in my opinion, Hugo Weaving gives a magnetic, frightening performance. And I think that's why a lot of people really like him, and I do as well, more than most of the villains thus far. In fact, he might have been my favorite, maybe aside from Loki. But the thing is, his character, not his performance, is extremely, extremely thin. And a huge part of that is because the filmmakers use the trope of, well, it's World War II, so he's a Nazi, and he's evil. You guys know that. Which is fine, and it's effective. But what that does is make the villain very, very one-dimensional and lackluster. There really isn't any emphasis put on him, and in the end, he's trying to bomb New York literally because, as somebody points out, he wants to prove that he's a god. So essentially, he's just another insane, power-hungry MCU villain. Wonder where we've seen that one before. Other than those two things, I don't really have anything negative to say about this film. I think the action is not standout or anything, and again, a lot of it is in montages, but it's serviceable and fun for the most part. Bucky and Steve's relationship is fun to watch, and it's probably the most personality Bucky's had in an MCU film, maybe ever. Which isn't his fault necessarily, because he's been a brainwashed assassin for the rest of it, but still. Although, his fake death felt very quick. Back in 2011, no one really knew that he was going to eventually come back, except for the diehard comic book fans. But the fact that they literally brush over it in a minute just kind of alluded to the fact that he would be coming back, and it was a fake death. Maybe that's me. I mean, I understand that there's a scene with Steve getting drunk or trying to and being sad, but it just didn't really impact me that much as a viewer. Oh, and something else that I haven't really touched on in the previous 4 reviews is the musical score. While the score hasn't really been egregiously terrible in any of the films, although Hulk gets pretty close in my opinion, it never really stood out in any of them either. I think Iron Man's score really did a good job at fitting in and meshing with the film, so it really didn't add or detract from a scene, and I guess that was the point, to, point the attention of the audience towards what was on the screen. This film. Maybe it's because I already knew that Alan Silvestri was the composer, but I could tell immediately just how far superior the musical score was. The talent and raw ability of Silvestri to wring out emotion from his films, it makes a huge difference. There were motifs and musical phrases that he established in this film that have been carried over to the future MCU films all the way to Endgame. And the theme from this film is the first one of Phase 1 that truly stood out. So major props go to Silvestri because he deserves a lot more credit than he ever gets. So yeah, Captain America the First Avenger. If you want a feel-good kind of MCU film with a lot of heart, then this is your movie. It's not exactly the deepest MCU film, and you won't be hit with a profound message or anything, but it's just a feel-good kind of movie, and you feel really good after you finish watching it. While it may not be as engaging as Iron Man, and yes, there are a lot of montages, it certainly got a lot of personality to entertain you for a couple hours. The amount of character development that they give Steve Rogers is insane, and it really shows just how important the foundation was for his character moving forward. The heavy lifting for this character has been done, and now we get to enjoy where he goes from here. I'll give Captain America the First Avenger a B+ and an 8.2 out of 10. If only we knew just how much he'd be saying this phrase throughout the rest of the MCU, because, well...
I can do this all day.
Yeah, I know.
Since Phase 1's almost over, coming soon is my review of The Avengers. Comment down below with your thoughts on Captain America the First Avenger, and let me know if you want to see me do any other videos. Make sure to subscribe and give this video a like to support the channel, and check out the description for some more content. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.